In January of 1965, Leo Fender signed a piece of paper. And with that signature, without a public announcement, without any warning to the players who had built their careers around his instruments, the most important guitar company in the world stopped being a guitar company. It became a television business. Most people know the CBS era produced worse guitars. That part is in every guitar forum, every vintage dealer listing, every reverb.com description that writes pre-CBS in the title. It is a legal guarantee of quality. But nobody explains why Leo sold. Not the real reason, the one that changes how you understand everything that happened after. By 1964, Fender Electric Instrument Company was the undisputed force in the American guitar market. The Stratocaster, the Telecaster, the precision bass, the jazz bass, Leo had built all of it, mostly by himself out of a small factory in Fullerton, California, with a team that never exceeded a few hundred people. The company was generating roughly $13 million a year in revenue. That is approximately $120 million in today's dollars. Small by any corporate standard. Enormous for a guitar shop that started as a radio repair business in a rented space in 1946. From the outside, Leo Fender had won. The Stratocaster was on the stage at every major venue in America. Session players in Los Angeles and Nashville had made the Telecaster the defining voice of country and rhythm and blues. Jimi Hendrix was playing a Strat. So was Hank Marvin. So was Dick Dale. Leo had nothing left to prove. Here's the part nobody tells you. Leo Fender had been seriously ill since the late 1950s. A streptococcal sinus infection, recurring, resistant, undertreated for years, had been draining him throughout the company's most successful decade. His doctors told him he might not survive another 10 years. Leo genuinely believed he was dying. And so when CBS came with an offer of $13 million, one full year of revenue for the entire company, every trademark, every design, every tool and jig on the factory floor, Leo said yes. Not because he wanted to cash out, not because he was tired of the work, because he thought he was running out of time, and he did not want everything he had built to collapse when he was gone. He was 56 years old when he signed. He lived until 1991. He was 82 when he died, still designing guitars. CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System, had nothing to do with guitars. They were a media conglomerate. Television, radio, Columbia Records. The Fender acquisition was part of a corporate strategy to diversify into what their analysts in 1965 called leisure goods. Guitars were leisure goods, so were bowling balls. CBS bought a bowling equipment company that same year. Let that settle for a second. The first changes were invisible. CBS installed professional management. Accountants replaced craftsmen in production decisions. Output targets replaced quality benchmarks. The goal shifted from building the best guitar to building more guitars per dollar of labor input. By 1966, just 12 months after the sale, Fender had expanded the Fullerton factory and increased production volume considerably. Players noticed nothing. The instruments looked almost identical to what Leo had been making. Almost. The first real tell was the headstock. CBS engineers decided the existing Fender logo lacked retail visibility. They enlarged the headstock, what players now call the large headstock Strat, to make the brand name more prominent on a music store wall. It was a marketing decision made by people who had never played a Stratocaster on a stage. It changed the neck resonance, not dramatically, but experienced players felt something was different and could not always name what it was. Then came 1971. This is where the CBS era became what players remember. A Fender manufacturing executive introduced the 3-bolt neck joint. The original Stratocaster used 4 bolts. 4 bolts, tightly fitted, created a solid mechanical connection between neck and body. Part of why pre-CBS Strats sustain the way they do. The new 3-bolt system included a micro-tilt adjustment mechanism designed to make setup faster on the production line. What it actually did was introduce instability. The joint could shift. Under string tension, over years of playing, it moved. Players reported tuning problems, dead spots on certain frets, a loss of sustain they could absolutely hear even if they struggled to explain it on paper. Session players in Los Angeles knew immediately you could not take a CBS-era Strat into a serious recording session without spending an hour on setup first. And sometimes it still was not right when the red light came on. The pickup quality degraded in parallel. Leo's original pickups were wound by hand, with slight tension variations between coils that produced the complex, slightly uneven tone players had built entire careers around. CBS standardized the winding process, more consistent output, more efficient production, and, according to blind listening test conducted decades later, noticeably thinner in the upper mid-range. The shimmer that players associate with a 1963 Strat, gone. Wood selection changed too. Pre-CBS production used alder and ash bodies chosen for weight, tap tone, and resonance. Under CBS, the priority shifted to lumber yield. How many bodies you could cut from a given plank without waste. Heavier pieces that Leo's team would have rejected started appearing in guitars leaving the factory. A 1974 Stratocaster can weigh nearly 5 kilograms. A 1962 model in comparable trim typically runs under 3.5. You feel the difference before you play a single note. Here's the strange part. CBS-era Fenders still sold. Aggressively. The brand was so dominant, the models so iconic, that players kept buying throughout the 70s. Fender's sales volume in 1974 was higher than at any point under Leo's ownership, but the resale market was already telling a different story. By the early 1980s, vintage dealers were separating pre-CBS instruments into their own category and pricing them accordingly. A 1959 Stratocaster that had sold new for roughly $240 was trading for several $1,000s. A 1972 Stratocaster, 12 years newer, far more available, was worth less than half that in comparable condition. The market had decided, and markets this consistent don't lie. In 1981, CBS brought in a new president for Fender, John McLaren, with a direct mandate to fix what 15 years of corporate manufacturing decisions had damaged. McLaren hired Dan Smith, a guitar industry veteran who had previously worked at Yamaha's U.S. operation, to lead product development. Smith flew to Japan, where domestic manufacturers had been producing Fender-licensed instruments since the early 70s. Fujigen Gakki, the factory responsible for many of those guitars, was building to tolerances that the Fullerton plant had abandoned years earlier. The neck pockets were tighter. The fretwork was cleaner. The finish application was more consistent. Those instruments, sold under the Squier brand name in export markets and through domestic Japanese distributors as JV Series Fenders, were in several categories better built than what was coming out of the California factory. Fender's own internal quality assessments from 1982 confirmed it. The Japanese instruments scored higher on consistency, fit, and finish than the American originals. Think about what that means. A company paying Japanese factory wages, building to a licensed spec that CBS had approved and then largely ignored, had produced a more consistent instrument than the source. CBS had spent 15 years optimizing for production cost, and the outcome was that they had been outrun by a licensee. CBS sold Fender in 1985. A management group led by William Schultz, who had joined as president in 1981, acquired the company for $12.5 million, less than what CBS paid for it 20 years earlier, adjusted for nothing. They bought it without a factory. CBS had sold the Fullerton facility to a separate buyer. Schultz's group owned the Fender name, the trademarks, the designs, the tooling, and had nowhere to build an American guitar. For approximately 18 months, Fender USA did not exist as a manufacturing entity. The only Fenders being produced came from Japan and a temporary facility in Brea, California, running at minimal capacity. 18 months, the most iconic American guitar brand in the world, temporarily without an American factory. The new plant opened in Corona, California in 1985. The American Standard Stratocaster launched in 1987, 4-bolt neck, revised pickups, stricter wood standards, and represented the first genuine attempt to rebuild what Leo Fender had made. Players who had spent a decade avoiding American Fenders started paying attention again. But here is what the CBS era actually cost, and it is not something that shows up in the spec sheet. The original Fender operation was built around Leo's specific obsession. He played guitar badly. He was famously, almost embarrassingly, not a guitarist. His employees joked about it openly, and Leo didn't care. He spent 30 years designing instruments for people who played far better than he ever could, and that gap drove everything. Every production decision came from a single question. Will a working player trust this? Will they feel the difference? Will they hear it? He visited music stores to talk to players. He showed up at recording sessions. He drove out to clubs and stood at the side of the stage and watched how players held his instruments under the lights. When he saw something that bothered him, he went back to the factory and changed it. CBS did not have that obsession. CBS had quarterly earnings targets and leisure goods divisions, and board members who grouped guitars and bowling balls into the same strategic category. And the 20 years between 1965 and 1985 are not simply a chapter in the vintage market. They are evidence of what happens when an instrument company stops being about the instrument. A clean pre-CBS Stratocaster from 1962 or 1963 sells today for between $30,000 and $80,000 on Reverb.com, depending on condition, originality, and color. A comparable CBS era 1972. Stratocaster in similar condition trades between $3,000 and $7,000. Pre-CBS Sunburst finishes in original cases, with hang tags have sold above $100,000 at auction. The gap is not nostalgia. Nostalgia doesn't hold up across 40 years of actual market data. The gap is real, measurable, and it has been widening every decade since the 1980s. The market hasn't forgotten. It never does. Leo Fender signed that paper in January 1965 because he believed he was dying. He thought he was protecting his legacy by transferring it to something larger, more stable, more permanent than a small factory run by one obsessive engineer in Southern California. What he could not have known is that the thing worth protecting was never the company. It was the obsession that built it. And that is the one thing CBS could never buy. Tell me I'm wrong, and tell me why.